because he was a doctoral student here at Stellenbosch. He was actually one of the first group of doctoral students that I had the privilege to also supervise. Wrote a wonderful doctoral dissertation, also working on the theme of the doctrine of the two kingdoms, with reference including to Calvin and the Reformed tradition. And it was very, very well received by the examiners, for which I was really grateful. And Simon also continued then with some ministry, and he's still busy with that within here in the southern suburbs, also with some church plants and relating aspects of the work that he's done to his own ministry. So we are grateful for you, and it's good also to see you again here in the building. And yes, if you don't mind then leading us also further.
Sure. Well, thanks, Professor Vosloo, for the opportunity to introduce our guests. Well, before I introduce Professor Darryl Hart, who will be giving the presentation in a minute or so, we also have Reverend Dr. Dan Borvin. He's out from Torrance, California. We actually have a group of ministers, scholars that will be presenting at a conference this coming Friday and Saturday. So a little plug for the conference, which is called Christianity and Liberal Democracy, Common and Separate. If you want more details on that, I can give that to you. It'll be kind of an extension of what you're going to hear soon from Darryl. So Darryl is a former professor of mine. He used to teach at Westminster Seminary, California, where I got my master's in divinity. And in fact, one of the books that was influential upon my dissertation was, and it was in manuscript form at the time, is one of Darryl's many books. Apparently, he writes books because he's never had any children, so he's had plenty of time on his hands. So one of many books that this is a Yale University Press edition of Calvinism: A History, and I think there are a number of books that I would commend to you, and you can certainly find those on Amazon or his Wikipedia page. But Darryl is going to speak to us today about Trump and evangelicalism, and I think that's highly relevant if we've been reading the news from overseas. And Darryl is also a ruling elder in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. Dan is a minister in the United Reformed Churches North America. So, yeah, we've got some esteemed colleagues. The next two will be arriving tomorrow, and we'll have quite a conference this coming weekend. But for now, I'll hand it over to Darryl.
Thank you. Nice to be with you. And I hope this wasn't too much falsely advertised. I will say something about Trump, but not a whole lot. But anyway, I mean, Trump is important for this. And I also hope I don't need to speak with subtitles or captions, because we speak the same language, but sometimes for we Americans, it's hard to understand some of the accent of South Africans, or so I may not be fully understood, and if I speak too quickly or something, let me know. Also a little intimidated by mentioning that book, because I've written about South Africa a little bit in that book, and I'm sure I got a lot of things wrong, so maybe you just want to ignore that. So I'm going to talk about Christian nationalism. And I've been interested in religious nationalism for at least probably a decade. So it's well before Trump in the 2016 election. I have a colleague and friend at Queen's University, Belfast. We're currently writing a book on Christian nationalism in America, and we're hoping to tie it into the story of a kind of Christian nationalism in the British Isles, so that the American version is kind of an extension. In some ways, the Puritans, city on a hill, but they were English people. Jonathan Edwards was a Brit more than an American, you could argue. Because he never lived in the United States of America. So I've had an interest in this. We've floated some different projects. We even had a podcast for a while, but everybody has a podcast these days. We did a podcast on religious nationalism, and we're really curious, not simply about Christian versions of it, but other versions of it in Western and non-Western parts of the world. not sure where that's going to go. So anyway, I'm hoping to talk about Christian nationalism and where it came from, but I want to start with a point about that there was a lot of study, as you may know, of nationalism well before Donald Trump. People who studied it broke it down along the lines of civic and ethnic. They would make that distinction. So ethnic nationalism was bad. That's what we associate with the Serbs or the Turks or the Nazis. But civic nationalism is what people typically associate with the French and American revolutions, where your citizen identity comes from laws and constitutions, not as if the French aren't attached to being French, not as if Americans aren't attached to some ways of being American as well. But there wasn't a lot of talk about religion in this literature on nationalism. And I was particularly interested in a couple books written just before the 2016 election, well, one book at least. John Judas, an American journalist, wrote a very helpful little book, Columbia University Press, on nationalism. And it was, in some ways, it was an appreciation of nationalism and what nationalism does for bringing people together for common purposes. I mean, I teach sometimes, I dabble in 19th century European and American history, and the creation of nation states is a really important phenomenon, both for good and for ill, in the history of the West, if not the world. So there's a recognition on Judas's part, who's a man pretty much on the left, not far left, but center left in America, that nationalism has excuse me, a purpose. And then Jill Lepore, who was sort of the Triple Crown winner. Triple Crown is a baseball reference in America. When you win the batting title, home runs, and runs batted in title. She's sort of that for American historians. She teaches at Harvard. And then she writes regularly for the New Yorker magazine. I can't remember what the third thing would be, but she's really important. She wrote a book after she did a big survey history of the United States. She wrote a book called America, This America, The Case for the Nation. This was in roughly 2017 or so. So she was trying to push back some ways against Trump, but still she was recognizing the importance of the nation. And this was a way of trying to push back against a kind of ethnic nationalism that maybe people were starting to associate with Trump, but also historically with various kinds of nationalism that were very disruptive in 19th century. Although, I mean, having just been in Greece this summer, my first time a college trip, so don't get me wrong, it was kind of, subsidized by the college. I don't normally travel around too much. This trip is also subsidized, so I like to travel, but I don't have lots of money to spend on it. But, I mean, thinking, as I had to while in Greece, about American, but also European support for Greek nationalism, Greek independence in the 1820s and beyond, there's like a celebration of Greek civilization and nationhood that, wait, this is a kind of nationalism. I thought nationalism was bad. This is also a kind of Christian nationalism because the Greeks were very much attached to the Orthodox Church. So anyway, that's one way of thinking about that. Then what changed in some ways when Trump came along, he gave a speech, I believe it was July of 2017 in Poland. And this is where he mentions themes like blood and soil, or land at least. He didn't say soil directly. And the American press, at least, went kind of ballistic over this, that he was echoing all these themes from kind of Nazi Germany and the like. So at this point, after Trump made that speech, there was a lot of talk about the dangers of white supremacy. This was during a time of lots of debates about the Confederate statues, and also notions of American exceptionalism as being parts of American identity and rhetoric that should be squelched or certainly modified. And then 2020 came with the George Floyd incident and the Black Lives Matter protests and defund the police. And so there was much more of attention and worries about white nationalism and white supremacy. But even to the summer of 2020, I would argue, I think I have some grounds for this, there's still no mention of Christian nationalism. It's still a kind of white supremacist nationalism Christianity may be in the backdrop, and particularly white Protestant Christianity, but still, there's no real talk about Christian nationalism. But then, and so this is the third piece, then came January 6, 2021, which in American imagination, January 6 is like 9/11. It's like this moment. And people saw crosses at the protest in Washington, D.C. And this is when people really began to write about Christian nationalism in a much more concerted way. I was just reading an article online from a theologian that we both, all three of us know, former colleague at Westminster Seminary in California, Mike Horton, who said that in this article about Christian nationalism, one of the most disturbing images he saw at the January 6th protests were crosses at the protest. There was like a ton of other stuff. People were, I mean, one of the guys who had the most images projected around the world was the guy in the horns, and there was nothing Christian about that, but still people saw the crosses. And having been in worship yesterday and hearing the text from Jesus telling us to take up our crosses daily, well, wouldn't you then take your... I'm just sort of kidding, but anyway, it is a kind of jarring sense that Jesus tells us to take up the cross, but then if you do it in certain ways. So anyway, that led to a series of books written by American academics, historians, sociologists. One of the first was a book called Taking America Back for God, written by two sociologists, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry. Another one came along next in 2021, also published by Oxford, a Yale University sociologist, Phil Gorski, and again Samuel Perry, co-author of the previous book, called The Flag and the Cross. I think I mentioned that was Oxford. I think that was 2021. So there's somewhat of a difference between the 2020 book, Taking America Back for God, and then The Flag and the Cross. The Flag and January 6th was already in the rearview mirror, so people then could talk about the January 6th insurrection in that book, which the scholars did. And then David Hollinger, a preeminent American intellectual historian, wrote a book in 2022, I think, with Princeton, called Christianity's American Fate, How Religion Became More Conservative and Society More Secular. But it was really a book about Christian nationalism in some ways and why it was still a problem. So these scholars are attacking the problem, and editors at university presses apparently thought that this was a phenomenon that needed scholarly attention, because some of these books are sort of the same book written many times. But one of the ways that these scholars, especially the sociologists, tried to identify Christian nationalism was with a survey that they produced and given to, 1,000 respondents or whatever. So I'm going to quote here from an article, a few paragraphs from an article I wrote about the Christian nationalism phenomenon more generally, where I compare Christian nationalism to COVID, in a sense, that people are trying to test and trace for Christian nationalism the way they were trying to test and trace for COVID. And I'm not trying to make light of this, but I mean, I still think there's, if you can't tell already, there's been a kind of hysteria about this that I think has been hysterical and not necessarily the most calm, dispassionate categories that we typically associate with scholarly debate. I thought, anyway, when I was in grad school many years ago. So here's a couple of paragraphs from this article. One of the parallels between Christian nationalism and COVID is the level of hysteria that both provoke among those who keep the gates of information in the United States. Christian nationalism has not generated international conferences of scientific experts presenting papers the way climate change and COVID have. But to find Americans carrying the religio-political virus, Christian Nat 21, sociologists have created a test. Both Taking America Back for God and The Flag and the Cross, two of those books I mentioned, rely on virtually the same sets of polling data. Both books use the following 6 statements to discern levels of attachment to Christian nationalism. So I'm going to read through those statements. First, the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. Second, the federal government should advocate Christian values. Third, the federal government should enforce strict separation of church and state. Fourth, the federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. Fifth, the success of the United States is part of God's plan. And then sixth, finally, the federal government should allow prayer in public schools. You can go to either of these books, two books I mentioned at the beginning, the sociological books, and they'll have the questions there if you want to see them again. But The Flag and the Cross, the second of the books, uses one more statement from a different data set to also try to identify Christian nationalism. And this statement is, I consider the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution to be divinely inspired. Now, if you know anything about Mormon history, you might be thinking that all Mormons would say yes to that. But so going on the basis of these statements, they go from, on a spectrum of 0, strongly disagree, to 4, strongly agree. The authors arrive at totals, either between 0 to 24, using 6 statements, or 0 to 28, using 7, that then place respondents in the categories. They have 4 categories. Rejectors, those would be the opponents of Christian nationalism. Resistors and accommodators in the middle, who are undecided about it in certain ways. And then at the other end are ambassadors, those who are wholly supportive of Christian nationalism. And what they found is that 19.8% of Americans are ambassadors, 32% are accommodators, 26% are resistors, and 21% are rejectors. So fewer, say, ambassadors than rejectors, but still alarming levels for these scholars. So compared to the alarm that journalists implied, with headlines about 81% of white evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump, the numbers are not obviously frightening because you don't have anywhere near 81% people lining up as Christian nationalists. Perhaps one of the most striking findings from Whitehead and Perry, this is the first book I mentioned, is that evangelicals account for 27% of the rejectors. That's in the opponent group, compared to 0 mainline Protestants, and Roman Catholics are only 4% in that category. So there are more evangelicals in the rejectors portion than there are in the ambassadors. More in that section. So that's another way that you might want to question how widespread this is among, say, white evangelical Protestants. So I go on here. Just like the PCR test in its take-home version for COVID, readers of these books can also take their own Christian nationalist temperature. And forgive the use of the first person, but I don't know any other way to report on my own responses to these questions. So I tested positive, though at the low end of the accommodators scale, which runs between 12 and 17 on the 0 to 24 spectrum. For instance, I strongly oppose the federal government issuing a declaration that the United States is a Christian nation. That gives me a 0 on that point. But for the government to advocate Christian values, like, for instance, banning murder, lying, and stealing, I know those aren't only Christian things, but still, I am unsure about the way to do this, so I get 2 points. On the strict enforcement of separating church and state, I tend to disagree, so I get 1 point, but the word strict is the issue, because zeal for separating it can wind up with a French-style laïcité, which has never been the American version of relating church and state. On government allowing for religious symbols in public spaces, I agree for the allowance, so that gets me 3 points, and also for prayer in public schools. That gets me 3 points. But I put a lot of weight on allow. The verb suggests government is not going to impose such religious expressions, but will stand back and let other institutions decide, like local governments, neighborhood associations, teachers' unions. Let those people figure it out. parents included. Then on the idea that the United States' success is part of God's plan, I agree, and I get 3 points. How could anyone who believes in a sovereign God, which I do, that not believe that there is some divine purpose behind America's place in the world? But at the same time, success is imprecise because it could indicate approval of America's emergence as a superpower, which I'm not always inclined to favor, or it could mean approving of religion's remarkable prevalence in American society, which it is, both in its gross excess at times, but also in other ways. So that's where the polling data could lead you, and it leads me in the direction of actually qualifying as some kind of Christian nationalist, which is somewhat ironic because I've written a book arguing for the separation of church and state to Christians to kind of back off religious politics. So I don't think this tool is that useful for identifying Christian nationalism, at least among Americans. So one more factor that came along here that I'll just mention briefly, but this is the rise of something in the United States, but it's not just the United States because it's also Roman Catholic, which is integralism. So there have been, in American conservative circles, Roman Catholics are very prominent, partly because they're very smart and partly because they pull on all sorts of political theory and political theology that comes out of the Western tradition in ways that evangelical Protestants generally can't. And so dissatisfaction with liberalism, political liberalism, Lockean kind of liberalism, the liberalism of the American founding, has led some American Roman Catholics to sort of pull out from endorsing that view. In the mid-20th century, John Courtney Murray, a Jesuit theologian, was very prominent in arguing for the American founding and its value for Roman Catholics. And he was a figure at Vatican II, and the way some American Catholics tell the story of Vatican II was this is finally a recognition by the Vatican that the American way of doing the church was a good way of doing it, that separation of church and state was actually a good way for the church to go. So Roman Catholics were very prominent in those sorts of arguments, conservatives of the kind who want to go back to the American founding. But then some intellectuals have begun to push back against that. Patrick Deneen, who's a political theorist at University of Notre Dame, wrote a book in 2017 that got a lot of attention, including President Obama having read the book and said something about it, called Why Liberalism Failed. So he was one of the first to, I say, liberalism is a failure, we have to get off this bandwagon. He's just written another book, I guess, where he tries to lay out something more positively for what we can do as an alternative. But also another important figure in this movement is Adrian Vermeule, which scholar, no reason necessarily to know. He was a clerk for Justice Antonin Scalia, Supreme Court Justice, now teaches constitutional law at Harvard. So he's not a slouch figure when it comes to American law, jurisprudence. He's also identified with this movement of integralism, which is a way to try to recover that throne-in altar arrangement of church and emperor or church and crown cooperating some way to lead to the good society. And then much more recently in the United States, an author, Stephen Wolfe, who's a graduate of Louisiana State University, published with a kind of obscure press, but he wrote a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism, which has created something of a, all sorts of sparks within the Protestant world and elsewhere in the United States. So those are two more factors that have contributed now to awareness of Christian nationalism and how people think about it. So let me then lead to my concluding point, although this may take a while, so don't start to pack up your books yet. I would say, sort of in looking at all this literature and development, that the United States has been always a pretty Christian place. It's not a formal establishment of Christianity in any way, of course, going back to the First Amendment, which applied to the federal government. State governments still had established churches, but the last one of those to fall was in Massachusetts in 1833. But Christianity has always been part of the warp and woof of American institutions and society. And it's even been part of the way Americans have told the story of the nation. So you can find all sorts of fingerprints of Christian nationalism in the historiography of the United States, even down into the 1970s, when people were already aware of the problems of that kind of narrative for race relations, for women's rights, for foreign policy in the midst of the Vietnam War. People were already questioning this, but still historians were telling the story a certain way. So one way to illustrate this, and again I'm going to quote from something I've written, a review of Mark Knoll's book, America's Book, which is he has 2 big volumes, History of the Bible in the United States, that stops with 1911. He decided to stop the story there. He said, it's just too big. It's too hard to tell it after 1911. Did I say 9/11? I meant 1911. But this is a really great book if you're interested in the history of the Bible and in one particular place for it, the United States, but it picks up on British developments as well. But here's from some of that review. Many Americans born after 1960, which doesn't include me, have trouble imagining that for much of the country's history, the Bible was a chief source of national identity. Older Hollywood directors sometimes get it right. Take Liberty Heights, 1999 movie written and directed by Barry Levinson, as you can probably tell by the name, and a Jewish American. The film explores relations among Jews, blacks, and WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, during the 1950s when Baltimore's public schools were integrated. That's where Levinson himself grew up. In one scene, the Jewish son of a burlesque theater owner watches an African-American girl, the daughter of a surgeon, during the class's recitation of Psalm 23, homeroom activities. They have different takes. He likens that recitation to singing the national anthem before a baseball game, at Major League Baseball. She says it provides a brief respite before a busy day of study. But whether ceremonial or therapeutic, Bible reading in public schools was, by the 1950s, among the last uncontested conventions of America's Bible civilization. Mark Knoll's book explains how the Bible achieved this status. The new nation's rejection of European forms of Christendom, such as sacral monarchy and state churches, left the Bible to bear the burden of America's attempt to create a Christian civilization. A complete secular republic was never a possibility except for the most free-thinking of free-thinkers. The founders, virtually to a man, insisted that a republic depended on a virtuous citizenry and that the best source of morality was religion. Despite the variety of Protestant denominations, church leaders and public officials agreed that the Bible was the best and most reliable guide for determining a moral consensus. One crucial component of Bible civilization, that's Knoll's phrase, was the creation of public schools, begun in Massachusetts in the 1830s to compensate for the Commonwealth's recent disestablishment of its state church. Schools included the Bible to instill public morality and assimilate children, and indirectly parents, to civic norms. The heavy-handedness of Bible reading in public schools also generated lively political controversies, known as the Bible Wars. Although many prominent Americans believed the Bible united the country, the founder Benjamin Rush, for example, and the education reformer and abolitionist Horace Mann, among them, other groups, Roman Catholics and Jews, dissented. Tussles over the Bible in public schools became heated, especially in places where Protestant elites squared off against non-British immigrants. In 1844, Philadelphia was the most violent front in these conflicts. Riots led to the deaths of 14 people and the destruction by fire of 2 Roman Catholic churches. Sort of like Belfast in the 1970s, that was Philadelphia in the 1840s. The political aspects of the Bible's history in America are not simply add-ons to a narrative that is mainly religious. Knoll attends as much to national themes as to the believers who drew inspiration and instruction from Scripture. Americans, for instance, from the beginning, used the Bible to name their towns. Zoar, Ohio, from Genesis 13. Ruma, Illinois, from 2 Kings 23, and 1,000 more. They also named their children after biblical figures. 10 of the first 16 presidents had biblical names: Thomas, Andrew, James, John, and Abraham. On the First Lady's side, 14 of the first 17 came from the Bible, including Martha, Abigail, Sarah, Elizabeth, Hannah, Anna, Priscilla, Julia, Rebecca, and Mary. The Bible also infiltrated Hollywood studios with such epics as Ben-Hur, based on Lew Wallace's 1880 novel. His book generated 4 remakes of the first screen adaptation from 1907, and with the Bible's implicit blessing from that movie, the movie generated whole lines of branded merchandise: cigars, flour, Bible wrenches, canned tomatoes, which might be a big thing here with the mateys, and paddle wheelers. As attentive as Mr. Knoll is to the gimcrackery of Bible civilization, his eye is never far from the Bible's importance in shaping, dare I say, Christian nationalism. Biblical and political ideals in the United States grew up together, married, and only began to spat during the Civil War. Here, during this period, Knoll is equivocal in passing judgment. He acknowledges that the Bible was a necessary ingredient, even not, if not always decisive, in exposing the wickedness of slavery and white privilege. African American conviction that the Bible proclaimed an undivided message of both eternal salvation and temporal redemption prompts Knoll to give Bible civilization a passing grade. Still, this judgment isn't progressive or Whiggish, because Knoll is quick to observe that appeals to Scripture easily encouraged the absolutization of public principle and inevitably resulted in the demonization of opponents. Meaning, if you appeal to the Bible, you leave little wiggle room for your opponents in a democratic society. So it's a mixed bag having a Bible civilization. It accomplishes things and also breeds other things. So my bottom line, first of all, is that nationalism itself is not at all bad. And depending on your perspective, but mine is that nationalism itself, the nation state, yes, they've gone to a lot of wars, but they've also preserved a common enterprise for a lot of people that, having been in Greece and seeing the destruction or the ruins of so many destructions, getting people to cooperate and organize is not a bad thing. But it can lead to war, I'm not denying that. So nationalism itself is not necessarily a bad thing. The sub-bottom line is that Christian nationalism has not been all bad. Narratives, particularly, are really important for giving meaning to life. I'm more and more convinced of that. Maybe it's because it's a function of age. But both for personal identity, we tell our own autobiographies in certain ways and give meaning to ourselves. But nations do this as well. And a big part of the American story had been some kind of Bible civilization. So it's hard to give that up. And right now the United States is having a big debate about how to revise those narratives. So Christianity has been a narrative very important to European nations and their descendants, the colonial societies that grew up to be nation states on their own. Places like the United States and South Africa. I'm not trying to lump us together, have different ways of emerging out of colonial societies, but that's the Christian story has been important to that, for good and ill. Please don't get me wrong, it's not just one side of that. So this point seems to me historically incontrovertible, and that scholars who criticize Christian nationalism simply on the basis of January 6th should have some perspective. They should react to it differently than, say, my mother did when she saw the Beatles for the first time. And I'll stop at that. She didn't like the Beatles. They had long hair, among other things. So I'll stop there and glad to take questions, comments, further discussion. No. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for what you presented. I think this topic of nationalism is also in our context the kind of topic that we are not, have been confronted to dealt with, but continuing to think about, because we often work with caricatures, what we think people mean when they use this term. So I think what you presented is helpful for us also in this context to think through some of the implications. And I think you've put out enough for us to really engage with in conversation. So let's open it up to hear maybe some questions, some comments. Also, can I ask, maybe it might not even be the case that everybody around the table know each other. If you don't mind just introducing yourself before you pose your question or comment.
May I ask something, say something? Anne-Marie van Hillsdale. I'm from Stellenbosch. I'm a product of the quirk of this seminary. Thank you so much. You made me think about a lot of things. Okay, so Christian nationalism in our context is what we all know and knew. And of course we know that it can go in any direction, as you mentioned. The morality issue is what I'm thinking. I'm kind of stuck on the morality.
Mm-hmm.
And the morality may be bigger than a cultural morality, a human order morality. And funny enough, but let me just say this. I followed January 6 on my couch. And I was drinking hot chocolate all through the night. And I really follow American politics closely every day. But it's not to say I know a lot, it's to say I try to understand.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've been thinking, I've been wondering, and it did cross my mind, it's just something I've been thinking of. The American political context at the moment with Donald Trump, it sometimes makes me think of immoral man and moral society. So the whole morality issue is something that I'm fascinated with. I don't know if you want to comment on that one.
Well, I mean, a couple of thoughts occur to me. One is that my own sense of my own tribe, which is a white conservative Protestant world, Presbyterian denomination, but also other Reformed churches in the United States, very small, mind you. I mean, evangelicalism is much bigger, and Methodists are much bigger, et cetera, et cetera. But that I think sometimes we have made arguments that make it seem like if you don't use Christianity or the Bible or some kind of Christian categories, you won't have any kind of morality, which to me doesn't make a lot of sense because of a whole world of I teach in a liberal arts environment at Hillsdale College in Michigan, and I've had to teach Greeks and Romans and the kind of ancient, it's once lately, I'm an American, so I don't really know this stuff, but it's been fascinating to teach. And it's not like Cicero didn't know morality. It's not like Aristotle didn't know morality. So there are other sources to go for this, but one that people buy into, the easy one, was for a long time Christianity and the Bible by virtue of the demography of the United States. So I do think there are other sources available, and there are people, Christians in the United States, Protestant and Roman Catholic, who appeal to a natural law tradition, and I think there's something to that, but then it winds up not getting very far, especially when it comes to policy and law. But the other side of it, too, is, I mean, okay, I'll say I'm a Calvinist. I hope that doesn't hurt me too much. But I do believe in human sinfulness and wickedness that goes way down, and I've been disappointed in the way that people have seemed to associate total depravity. The first, which head is it in the canons? It's not the first. Is it the first head?
No, maybe the third.
Third head. I mean, it's a T in tulip, but in 5 points. But as if Donald Trump is the only person with total depravity. I mean, it's like people need to look in the mirror, I think. And it's not as if, and I'm not trying to, I mean, my wife doesn't like Trump. I don't like Trump either, but my wife has been off the charts not liking Trump. So I've had to kind of negotiate these waters. And I mean, I think some of Trump's policies, given the economic plight of, say, of ordinary Americans, where a lot of jobs got offshored. So a lot of elites on the coast made a lot of money by having those jobs go offshore, but a lot of people got left behind. And I think Trump was trying to speak for some of those people, and maybe he wasn't speaking that well, and he certainly couldn't appoint people to execute policies very well. So that's the real limitation of trying to elect someone like Trump, is that guy doesn't know how to do politics. But the morality side of it, and I'm not meaning, and I hope I'm not slighting your question, but I don't think his opponents in either of the elections, either Ms. Clinton or Mr. Biden, are necessarily fonts of virtue themselves. If you look into their, I mean, I think every politician is like got to be one of the most ambitious, self-seeking people there is. I just don't. That's the way democratic politics work. It seems to me you have to have a pretty large ego. Now, Trump's is, on steroids, arguably, but how to get people of character. I mean, that was kind of the evangelical brand of politics in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, who, there were lots of people who said he wasn't a man of character because he's divorced at least once, if not twice. I can't remember. So how could he be a man of character? But, he looks like a Sunday school pupil compared to Trump in a way. So, I think character is important for public life, but there's so many other factors in political life, in the nature of the American system of government, relations between executive branch, Congress, the courts, but then the whole regulatory state and the federal agencies. I don't think it's possible to take your eye off that part of government, and I don't know where you go with morality on that point. So, for instance, the national security apparatus in the United States, I mean, they do a lot of bad things around the world, as you probably well know, and I understand why people don't like Americans for that reason. They do a lot of bad things to American citizens as well, too, as we've learned of late with revelation of Twitter files and whatnot during COVID and other things. So this is one of the reasons why I still kind of believe in the American founding. The idea of checks and balances in government and limited government. If that's, I don't know how to fit that together with, say, morality of public figures. But it seems to me the founders did understand that political leaders could be pretty selfish in their endeavors, and so having checks and balances on government was a way to restrain that. And we've lost some of that, it seems to me, because we've identified one party with the vicious and one party with the virtuous, and that doesn't do justice, it seems to me, to human nature and what the founders themselves thought they knew, even though some of them weren't the best of Christians. I mean, I wouldn't want Thomas Jefferson to be my Sunday school teacher, for instance. But I like Jefferson a lot, by the way. But he had a lot of problems too.
Thanks.
I don't know if that
Thanks.
long-winded, but
Dion? And then
David, thanks for a really interesting and stimulating presentation. I'm Dion Foster, I'm one of the faculty here.
thank you.
I mean, I'd like to just sort of broaden the conversation a little bit, and what interests me is the sort of dialectic that exists between the history of religious thought and the formation of political structures, and in which order they fit. Now, it seems to me that in your presentation, you're sort of fitting religion as a pre-existent structure to the emergence of a political structure called America. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Marcia Paley. She wrote a book called Commonwealth and Covenant, and
Yes,
one called The New Evangelicals. So she follows a sort of similar trajectory. The challenge, of course, with that, and this is one of the pushbacks on nationalism, and in particular Christian nationalism, is that America is not the world.
Right.
And for many of us who live elsewhere in the world, there's a sense of pushing back against against American exceptionalism. That somehow, you know, the God of God bless America is the God of Christianity. That, you know, American-style democracy is to be equated with the ways in which God seeks for a just society to be run.
It's not?
And that American capitalism is the way in which we should order our economic life. So my sense is that, you know, I wonder whether sometimes we don't make the mistake of superimposing a sort of a early modern or modern political structure as a sort of hermeneutic lens onto the ways in which we think about how God structures society. And I think that's been for me one of the challenges with the exporting of a certain kind of American evangelicalism into Africa, is that it's led to a kind of politics which it's not our politics. It's not the ways in which we structure our societies. You know, for us, individualism is in general not a primary way of making sense of the world. So I wonder if you can just comment a little bit on that sort of tension between America as a nation state and a political construct within the context of globalization.
I mean, so I'm not sure what the alternative would. I'm not trying to dodge the question, but what the alternative is to say the early modern leading to the modern nation state in the West would be, what is the alternative model? I mean, I can understand that there have been attempts at alternatives. Also, it seems to me, if those on the left have often been very Western themselves. I mean, Marxist or socialist stuff is not exactly coming out of indigenous peoples around the world. But, I mean, my own perspective actually is in some ways informed by, again, studying the ancient world and then the way that Christianity sidled up to the Roman Empire when emperors became Christian. And that was a great recovery then of the Hebrew monarchy as a kind of norm for the Christian prince or king or queen. And the reformers themselves, Protestants, didn't back away from that. I'm currently finishing a book on Presbyterianism and British politics, and the Scots were sometimes kind of nuts about the covenants and kings and national covenants and the like. And so in my reading of a liberal democracy like the United States, and I think there's an Anglo-American political tradition that is different from other European traditions. So, and how South Africa fits into that is a whole nother question. I mean, you have both, at least Dutch and British presences here coming out of Europe, obviously. But I look at the American founding as kind of adjusting to that imperial Christianity that had almost a 1,400-year run in different forms in both the Eastern Byzantium, but then various versions in Europe. And it may not have been the best way out, but it was one way out. And so for context where that's the kind of structure, it might make sense. But I mean, that is some ways what, for me, makes America exceptional, is that was a way out of that system. The French had another version of exceptionalism, which didn't, in my estimation, didn't go as well as the American
but
did.
I wonder whether, I mean, sorry to come back
Sure.
to this. I think, I mean, what makes France different, and, you know, the Roman empires, that in large measure those were ethnic nation states.
Yeah.
That developed in that. I mean, Hannah Arendt's sort of notion that, you know, what makes people American is their willingness to submit themselves, not on ethnic or linguistic or religious lines, but to submit themselves to a form of common governance. And I worry sometimes a little bit about, you know, how that sort of transfers in the globe.
Right.
Because, I mean, you know, there is no doubt that, I mean, part of what makes American style democracy so pervasive is that the world is captured by America's dominance of the global economy.
Right.
So, you know, there's a sort of circular argument that says, well, we can't escape it, or give us another model. Well, it's difficult to do that while the people whose model it is dominate the world in
Right.
just about every way.
Right. I mean, at
And
least
I-
the way.
just to say, what makes me relatively uncomfortable about that is then when we attach that to theological categories.
Right.
To say, well, it's God who makes it this way, and God is on our side, and we are fulfilling our divine history, and that makes us
Right.
exceptional.
Well, I mean, in my understanding of U.S. history, that, and this is going to turn us into victims, but so forgive me, but we had global hegemony thrust upon us. I mean, that's not entirely true. But after World War II, Europe's a mess, so that leaves the United States and the Soviets as the two competing global powers. And I don't think you want to give that kind of power to the United States, to be the leader of the so-called leader of the free world, when you have people who are, I mean, I still think in many respects we function as a colonial society. Most Americans don't give a rat's behind about foreign affairs or foreign policy, and yet we're the most powerful nation in the world in some ways. I think that's a really bad recipe. Whenever I travel and I watch BBC, I still see semblances of the British Empire that thought they were kind of responsible for the rest of the world. They cover the world so much better than any news organization in the United States does, because they were part of an empire. The United States is an empire, but we don't think we are. We're just a little republic. What do we know? Although we have lots of important figures, especially in the 1950s, when we're coming out of the war. And this is where you get a strong dose of Christian America, which these sociologists and historians don't pay enough attention to. Figures like the Dulles brothers, who were head of the State Department and the CIA, sons of Presbyterian minister, and they're liberal Protestants through and through, but they think they're doing God's work around the world. Are you kidding me? So our record of being a global hegemon, for me, is really uncomfortable. I mean, I just think we're pretty naive and often ignorant about the way we've done it. But the way history unfolded, I mean, Europe just couldn't rally to that point. So, it doesn't surprise me at all the United States goes into places and does all sorts of foolish things. But I don't know what more does. So, I mean, I appreciate your point. I guess I'll say it that
Thank
way.
you.
Yeah.
And just to say, your answer is far more sophisticated than mine.
No, I don't know about that, but
Objections, so
no.
thank you.
One of the reasons why I like to travel and talk to people is to hear local angle on things, and I don't interact with a lot of South Africans that much, so it's really useful for me.
I'm Jürgen Hendricks. I am an emeritus professor here. I was in practical theology and especially interested in congregations and what's happening to congregations. And I'm sort of following Christianity today on this, on what is happening in religious-wise and denominations in the USA. And the basic picture is that all the mainline denominations are going down, losing members badly.
Yeah.
All the reform branches, you can see that. And then, in the last couple of years, they are relating that drop in membership to Trump, and pointed out in several of the articles. Now, it's very popular, so that's why I'm asking your comments on it. That, for instance, the evangelicals are the strongest single support group of Trump. And if you look at the biggest group, it's the Southern Baptists, they have dropped membership from something like 16 million, lost about 3 million, especially if you look at their baptism figures, it's going down.
Right.
So there's definitely secularization is playing a major role in all Christian or Protestant denominations worldwide. And it took longer for America to get there, but it's happening now. But I was wondering to which extent Trump's morality and style and everything influences that. Because young people just are not interested in this sort of religion.
So, I mean, I guess one way of thinking about it, the way I think about it at least, is that institutional church life has been on the decline for a while. And evangelicals are the leading edge of that in some ways. The whole megachurch phenomenon, for going on 30 years at least, has not been good for denominational life. And denominations have their own particular history and context, and they may not be enduring, but I do think institutions are important. Just as nation states are important, I think institutions are important for organizing people in different ways. The Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam wrote a famous book that I've only dabbled in and skimmed, and I can name the title, Bowling Alone, which is a great book, makes an important argument. It gives me an excuse to lead my students. I don't pay for them, but we go bowling once a semester to try to make a point. But it really isn't about bowling. It's about forming these networks and clubs and membership in different things. And membership in churches has just not been much of a factor. But I do think that Trump is a political figure that represents an anti-institutional understanding of politics. So you have an anti-institutional Christianity that goes with an anti-institutional political figure. Michael Lind is an American author, political scientist who used to teach at University of Texas, who I admire a lot. And he used to be a conservative, but he's kind of like in no party now. But his analysis of the decline of institutions, among them political parties, unions, I mean, he does on that scale what Putnam was doing with these local sort of variety shop institutions, say. So I do think there's a correlation in that way. And, somebody who's deficient in a moral perspective, as I would argue, I would agree that Donald Trump is, I don't know that he's going to be the convinced of the importance of institutions and norms for those institutions, whatever those norms are going to be. So he's a really bad vehicle for people who feel like the system has left them out, but they need institutional representation, it seems to me. So political parties coming back, whether they all become Democrats or all Republicans, but still make those parties great again. But also unions, perhaps, bringing those back as well. Those seem to me like important factors, but again, I'm not sure even evangelicals appreciate the importance of institutions if they themselves don't see the importance of the institutional church, as it were. So that's kind of go ahead if you want to follow up.
Let me think first.
Yeah.
Sure.
Give someone else.
I think we have time for one question or two questions. I also got a question, but I don't want to misuse my position. So what I was thinking while you were talking is just what to do with nationalism, and how to think theologically about nationalism, but not merely about it in a sort of vacuum, but in specific contexts where you are grappling with real plurality. Because it seemed to me, and I did a bit of work on Afrikaner nationalism, especially in the 1930s and onwards, and the rise of Afrikaner nationalism. And this was a very interesting phenomenon because it started out as an anti-colonial project, as against the empire.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a strong sense of language of nation and empire. So some of the sermons were even, God makes the nation and the devil the empire. So that kind of sense of it's a beleaguered identity and nationalism is important for our kind of project, and it played that kind of role, and then this kind of beleaguered identity turned over into what became the kind of apartheid policies and this kind of marriage between Afrikaner nationalism and apartheid ideology and theology became very comfortable, although you can say that it came from different, it was motivated in different ways, and it played out in the society. So then, of course, as a response to that kind of Afrikaner nationalism, you also had the growth of black nationalism, because both the ANC and the Nationalist Party all have this sense of a national project as part of their core identity. And I remember, we are here in the Beyer Center for Public Theology, and here's his sermons, but how he would speak to people like Afrikaner or black nationalists and say, well, don't make the same mistake. Don't go for nationalism as a way to deal with what's going on in the country, and what does it mean to love the country, what does nationalism do to people. So in many ways people would analyzing what's going on now in terms of new forms of tribalism and so on, that it seems that kind of thing is such a real temptation, and it then leads to reactions and new nationalisms of sorts. But what I'm actually interested in, this is what I want to hear you, is that even with the new South Africa, the temptation was again to go for a nationalist identity. And some political theorists here at Stellenbosch, somebody like Johan Degenaar, spoke about the myth of a South African nation and sort of warned against taking up this language of the nation concept as a way of thinking about society. But of course it was very, very tempting, because you think that the idea of the nation is that unites. Now he was more in favor of that form of nationalism, that you can say it's still a form of nationalism or nation understanding that's linked to a constitution or to plurality within it. But if we now look back at what happened in the last 30 years, the question is if we shouldn't have heeded that call to be a bit more critical of also these forms of thinking about the nation, and then linking Christian projects and theological projects to this. So this is just saying a lot, and it's quite a mouthful. But I think that the experiences of being wounded by nationalism does change a bit your perspective on thinking through how to guard against that negative aspects, because we can romanticize the real effects of these kinds of projects. So it just, I would just say the difficulties of dealing in pluralistic societies with nationalism, because it's such a strong thing, requires some real wisdom politically, but also theologically.
Right. I mean, what's intriguing about your question and comments is that, I mean, the way I understand nationalism post-World War II in the United States is that you need a collective national identity if you're going to be the leader of the free world. You need everybody to buy into that in some way to support the national security apparatus and all the stuff that's going on, for good or ill. Nobody's talking about the ill, of course. It's all good. But when you come to South Africa, I don't mean to diminish your size, but it's not, you don't have those kind of global responsibilities necessarily, and yet you're recognizing that nationalism also has a limited value, function for even, because my own tendency in the American context, sorry to keep hitting the mic, is to think of regionalism as a way out. So the northeastern United States, the southern United States, the northwest, whatever, and have kind of attachments in a provincial way, and then have only a national identity when it comes to defense of the nation and some other national elections or whatever, federal elections. But we didn't necessarily, the United States conceivably didn't have the luxury of doing that if you're going to be the leader of the free world. I don't know what the alternative history of the world is if the United States doesn't emerge as that player. Again, I'm not trying to defend that. I just don't know what the historical alternative would be. But even then, your question suggests that a plurality of identities, which is what I would favor in the United States even, didn't seem like an alternative or one that people bought into. Maybe it could come back, but I guess the bottom line in some ways is how do you, even in those smaller identities that aren't the nation, whatever they may be in whatever context we have, whether regional or ethnic or something, is that going to be sufficient to have a kind of collective endeavor, even for that group, or not? And I don't know. I mean, I guess I could find cases in the history of at least Europe, which I'm somewhat familiar with, where there might have been that more, and maybe even still, I mean, even in the United States, where the way the federal system works, states wind up doing a fair amount, granted with federal money, but still, there's a, as we learned, whether we wanted to or not during COVID, different states were doing different things with a general guidance and also funding. So, I mean, if you could, my thought is, my hope would be that if the United States could not have as much of a foreign footprint and let us think more about our own selves and let other people do what they want around the world as well, maybe we could make it. But usually, South Africa might make it seem like that's not going to happen.
Yes. No, that is, I think, that is a very difficult thing because, it's one. We usually, prefer that people do their own thing unless we have interest in that place. Then we don't like them to do their own thing. So that's part of the problem of politics now. It's intertwined also with other aspects. I think we can go on with this discussion. So I think it is. I felt also when you were speaking that it was engaging. So thank you very much for this, Darryl. We really appreciate it. And
well, thanks for coming. It's really been great to meet you.
We look forward to continuing the discussions. And thanks also for everybody that participated. We really appreciate it. And this is, of course, an ongoing discussion for us. But also, one of the things that seems to be clear is that this is a global discussion with the rise of new nationalism in all its complex forms. And I think we are, everybody is talking about it and thinking about it because of the difficulty of the topic and trying to make sense of it. And the moment that people feel they've got a grasp on the reality, they don't, because there's so many exceptions and nuance and distinctions in this discussion. So yes, thank you very much.
Can I just possibly comment? I just want to say thank you very much for being here. I'm not a chicken anymore, and I've been privileged to be born in Zimbabwe from an Afrikaans family, Dutch Reform Foundation, and I was at school here in Stellenbosch, university here, also overseas, and I've gone through a lot of things, and when my children were there, I decided I want to go back to Zim and really put back into the community, because that's where we got our opportunities to go to the best schools and do this. And I was, I did medicine, I was a specialist, a dermatologist, and we were also in the UK, and I started a company about the truth about skincare and all the corruption that there is in the cosmetic industry. And I had two people that God sent over my path. The one, I was at Kids Beach in just south of East London, beautiful place, beautiful, very wealthy guy, everything, party. And Matthijs, if you died today, where are you going? I thought, what's this question? So I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, if you died today, are you going to heaven or to hell? There's only two destinations. So I said, well, they say I'm a good Christian. I'm the youngest elder in the oldest Dutch Reformed Church in Cape Town. So I'm trying my best. So I hope I'll go to heaven. But I haven't got the audacity to say I will go. So my English friend said, Matthijs, if you die today, you're going straight to hell. And the Boer War was flaming up in me again. And I thought, who are you to judge me? And he said to me, Matthijs, your answer tells me you're not born again in your spirit. I said, what is that? And he explained it to me, and I went to think about it and everything, and I could just say, I am born again in my spirit, and I can take no credit for it. My life has been exploring, and I believe God has been pushing me into corners. And we had a wonderful time just with my family, with my wife, with my children, of just understanding. And being a dermatologist, God showed me that all community, black, white, brown, all religions come from Adam and Eve. And why are the people in the African or hot areas, why have they got more pigment? The only difference between blacks, whites and browns is the amount of pigment in the epidermis. And it's very interesting, why have we got straighter hair, the more people that came out of Europe, because our families came out of 1600, 1700 came from Europe. Why we got more straight hair than our brothers that also come from Adam and Eve, and they've got these, what do you call it? And when I share this with my brothers, my black brothers, I said to them, I'm just amazed, because when I did a lot of operations, under the skin, everything's the same. All nationalities, religions, everybody. And it's very interesting to realize that there were adaptations through hundreds of thousands of years. But basically, we are all created in His image. But God, what happened was, when I was born again, I realized religion is very dangerous. All religions, including Christianity. Because it's a relationship with God. And what I experienced more and more as I started reading the Bible, and that's one of the things, when you look at the creation, it declares the glory of God. When you read the Bible, you've got to either say the Bible is the Word of God, or it's not the Word of God through people. And I made a decision, this is God's Word. And my question, because my family were governors of the Reserve Bank in South Africa, we were in politics, ministers, but what a mess. And all I would like to just share with you, you're much more in religion, I'm more in relationships. And I just want to encourage you that I there's no reason for poverty and fighting and killing. But the fact is that God created man, and he said to the first man and wife, I want you to enjoy and populate this planet. Enjoy. And what he then did, he said, but there's one test. And the question is, what is the most important thing in a relationship? I thought it was love. I was taught it was love. But I found out it's trust. And God said to Adam and Eve, God said to Adam and Eve, enjoy everything, but trust me. There's just one tree you mustn't touch. Trust me. And the minute that they trusted Satan to touch that and eat, the relationship with God was broken. And they went into a relationship with Satan. And this is why the Bible tells us that we're all born in sin, that we don't trust God. And this is why God the Father sent Jesus and put him on the cross. And now he says, trust me that my son died for you.
That's the center of
Thank you.
I think that brings it back to Calvinism and radical sin and radical grace.
It does.
So
much.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
For that, and thanks to all.
Thanks, man.
You want to take this off until so I don't bump it again?
Colleagues.
Thanks.